All right. All right. We're live. Hello, everybody. International Master David Bruce here. And let's just make sure that's working. If you've got any questions for me about the games, come into the chat room there and ask them. So today we're going to be looking at Carlsen versus Anand Game 7 from the World Championship match. And it's going to be kind of a brief review today because I wasn't really able to understand this game. But I will tell you the small bits that I could understand and, tell you what my questions are and, orient you to where I think we're at in the match or what the possibilities are coming from here. So today's game, Carlsen had white, and Anand switched back to the Ruy Lopez Berlin defense, which he had lost with in the second game of the match. So there are a number of interesting questions just about the opening choice in this game. Number one, I've said several times that I don't think Anand should be playing the Ruy Lopez. He did lose a Sicilian game the day before yesterday. There was a rest day, but the previous game, Anand lost in an open Sicilian. To me, it was a random variation, and he should have been able to prepare something else and continue playing the open Sicilian, and that was definitely still the way to go. And I wouldn't have been as disheartened as he was, or as his team was, or whatever, as they were about that game. I think that was still definitely the right opening to be playing. So I was surprised to see him play the Ruy Lopez Berlin defense again. And then I was surprised that Carlsen chose to go into the famous Berlin endgame. Now, let's just put that up on the screen for a second so we all know what we're talking about. So the Berlin endgame comes about after the knight f6, knight takes e4 early on. d4 here takes. Queens are traded on move 8. This is what Kramnik used to draw Kasparov a bunch of times in their World Championship match and thus win the World Championship. And a lot of people say that this opening is right up Carlsen's alley. And indeed, he's had some good results in this endgame. But I don't think it's the very best possible opening for Carlsen. And the first time that Anand played the Ruy Lopez Berlin, Carlsen avoided the endgame by playing d3 on this move, just defending e4. And he won that game very convincingly. Now, why do I think that this opening here is no longer to Carlsen's style and taste, even if, a couple of years ago it really was? Well, that's because there's too much opening theory on this opening now. Yes, I think Carlsen loves, in theory, a position like this, an endgame with, one or two imbalances, the king in the center, the bishop pair, the doubled pawn, right? Yes, I think he loves such positions, and if he could get you into a position like this that you hadn't analyzed before, woe is you. But the problem with the Berlin defense is that it's been analyzed so far. So basically it allows the opponent to play, 20 moves or 25 moves that a computer has analyzed before, that other 2,700 players have played before in tournaments. And so they get to play a bunch of free moves without having to think on them or work on them. And in this game, let me just click ahead and show you how far opening theory went. Not just opening theory, how far a previous game went. And I recognized this even. I'd seen this at a recent tournament. All of this, played before. You see how a lot of the tension has come out of the position. This pawn sacrifice was previously analyzed, right? The trade on f6. All of this, which we could cover if you really wanted to. All of this position here has been seen before. This is all just opening theory. So basically, that's like 25 moves that Anand doesn't have to think about. And by the time Anand has to think about the game, he only has like 3 pieces versus 3 pieces. It's a fairly simplified endgame. So, you don't have to keep your focus for as long and analyze as difficult problems to come out successfully from this kind of an opening. So that's why I think this is not to Carlsen's taste. I don't think Carlsen likes starting the game in a position like this one here, even if it's an endgame. There's not enough tension left, not enough different strategies and different ways you can try and put pressure on your opponent to try and beat them starting from here. So to me, that's not a Carlsen position. And What I'm surprised by is why did Carlsen play into the endgame when the anti-Berlin with d3 had worked so well for him in the previous game where Anand played the Ruy Lopez. So that's a little bit confusing to me because I would have thought that Carlsen would want to repeat one of those anti-Berlins with d3 and play like a long maneuvering Ruy Lopez and be very confident that he could put some actual serious pressure on Anand with that. I don't really have an answer for why he did that. But the question is really going to be whether or not he thought he had good chances to win this Berlin endgame or what his match strategy was here. Not only could I not understand why he would prefer the endgame to a longer maneuvering game, but I couldn't understand what specifically he was going for in this position. So let's get back to that now, and let's look at this position. So the position where we start, where basically the players start analyzing or thinking for themselves, I guess, is here. I found a previous game, which I will click to show you. You can recognize that this is the same position here. This is from last month, Anish Giri versus Timur Rajabov. So two other players who are basically like approximately number 10 in the world. So really top players whose games get seen. And they played here, rook h7, same move. And here Rajabov played f5. Whereas in this game, Anand played knight f7. So this position here was played a month before. I would be surprised if the players didn't know that game. And so the question is, did Carlsen think that white has winning chances in this position? So let's have a look at the position and try and evaluate it and try and understand why he might think he has chances to win. First of all, previous result was a draw. So that's not encouraging, right? That the previous game was a draw. So white would want to have some kind of improvement over what happened in the other game. In the other game where f5 was played, well, we can analyze that in a second. Let's just evaluate before we go ahead. So materially, black is ahead 1 pawn. This whole variation is a pawn sacrifice from white. So that's one thing to be aware of here. So it's a pawn sacrifice. Next important feature, white has a nice pawn majority on the king side, actually. This is a decently strong majority with an isolated pawn to maybe go after. And good potential to make a pass pawn. Black's on the queen side got 4 pawns against 2, so that's also a pretty healthy majority. So even though black's up a pawn, it looks like each side sort of has the opportunity to maybe make one pass pawn. So that makes it less of a big advantage for black to be ahead of pawn, but still, there's not that many pieces on the board. A pawn is definitely worth quite a lot at this point. But yeah, so white has his own majority. So even though he's down a pawn, white could possibly make a pass pawn. Next important factor, the white rook is very active on the 7th rank and has the black king sort of stuck in a more passive position. So that is an advantage for white, definitely a significant one. That's the main activity advantage, is the rooks and kings, right? Like each player's knight and bishop can move around pretty freely in this position. I would say all 4 of the minor pieces are pretty active pieces. The question is the pressure from this rook, right? It's attacking pawns on the 7th rank. It's pinning this king down, and white's king can get involved. Meanwhile, black's rook is kind of hemmed in here, right? Like it doesn't have a lot of moves. And even if it moved away, it might leave this pawn vulnerable. So it's sort of doing not a glamorous job, but it's doing a duty here that may force it to stay where it's at for the moment. Okay, so all that, white has like a nice activity advantage with the rook. And one other important factor to notice, since we're so close to trading off all the pieces, is the opposite colored bishops. The opposite colored bishops like dramatically increase the chances of a draw. There's like so many. I mean, if black could trade all 4 of these pawns for these 2 pawns and end up with opposite colored bishops, he'd have an easy draw with 1 against 2. And that would be, him trading 4 pawns for 2, and he'd still have an easy draw. So the opposite colored bishops give like so much latitude for making a draw in this position, in my opinion. The opposite colored bishops can be okay for the side that has the advantage if they're really attacking, but this doesn't look like a dramatic attacking game to me. White has some pressure, some extra activity, but they're not really like attacking very ferociously here. I just can't accept that. All right, so let's have a quick look at one variation from the previous game. If f5 is played, f5 is looking to immediately trade pawns or create a new blockade when the pawn moves forward, which is what Geary played. He played g5. Once he's played g5, the pawn sort of blocks in the bishop, and it's easier for black to blockade on light squares against white's pawn majority. So even though it's like handing the opponent a passed pawn, with opposite colored bishops, sometimes you want to do that to establish the blockade. But a critical variation would be rook takes c7, which Geary didn't play. That wins a pawn, attacks the knight, and opens up this rank for the rook, right? So seems good, but black plays knight b5, attacking the rook. So the rook has to eat that. This is defended. And now black has time to capture the pawn on g4. And now basically white loses both their queens. I mean, both white's queenside pawns get traded off. And now white's trying to win with opposite colored bishops, 2-on-2 on one side of the board here, for example. And that is something that basically, this is very, very implausible that white could win it just because they're running out of material to win with versus these opposite colored bishops being on the board. One other small move that white could throw in would be pawn takes f5, attacking the rook before moving this rook. So now knight takes, pawn takes is a little bit dangerous for black because white has two passed pawns, although there's a good chance that's also a draw. I haven't looked at it because a better move is to just take here, defending the rook, and white can get this pawn and black can get this pawn. So now again, you have knight and opposite colored bishop and 2 pawns versus 2. Is white still a little bit better? Yes, black's king is cut off by the active rook. Is white running out of material with which to plausibly win the game? I would argue that yes, white's also running out of material with which to ever try and win this kind of position. So, I mean, does black have to pay attention and defend like carefully in these kind of positions? Yes, but does he have to defend carefully for like 100 moves or 5 moves? I feel like these kind of positions only require a few moves of precision, and then it sort of starts to clarify, and it's like pretty easy to draw. So I don't think there's much risk for black here. And I think that demonstrates how white's activity, could cash in for a pawn here, but because of the opposite colored bishops, if black can trade off a few pawns of white's, you're not really left with anything to work with to try and win a game. Okay. That said, Anand didn't even repeat this move f5, which seemed to give Rajabov a pretty comfortable draw in this game. Just for reference, you can sort of see what it looks like. He then plays knight f7, blocking the 7th rank the same, but now there's pressure against this g5 pawn. So white defends it. And black just goes to the h-file, trades rooks, gives up this pawn, sets up the light squared blockade. And I don't think from here white ever threatened anything for the rest of the game. I think it was pretty equal. This computer might be giving an evaluation of like 0.3 advantage for white or something here. I don't know for sure how this interface works that they're using, but basically the position looks like a pretty comfortable draw for black by blockading the light squares with the opposite colored bishops. Materials equal, white has a passed pawn, black doesn't yet, but it doesn't look like much to play with to try and win. So in my opinion, Rajabov made a pretty convincing draw with f5. And Anand says, I'll draw a different way with knight f7. And frankly, I don't see how Carlsen was ever really threatening to win this game, personally. And it could well be because I just don't see his plan. So, for example, knight e3 gets played. I want to go ahead 1 or 2 moves. King here. Oh, yeah, knight e3 was played rather than taking on c7 because of f5 for black, trading queenside pawn, trading pawns, right? So winning back the c7 pawn is not good enough if black just trades here. So knight e3 is played to prevent f5. The king defends here. Knight f5, and we see sort of like the fullness of white's activity. If black trades, they lose material because their rook and knight are attacked. Knight g3. And in this position after knight e5, things got concrete because white could trade and play rook h5 and try and win a pawn. So before we get into that, I just want to say, let's say black doesn't play knight e5. If we just look at this position. So a simple move might be like b6. Just defending this pawn some more. You know, or black could mark time with his king, or he could play a5, gaining some more space or something. Okay, here's the issue for me. I personally don't see at all what white's plan is here in terms of using their nice activity to try and make progress. I do see that white's position is better than black's. I do see it's more pleasant. I do see this pawn structure is very nice for white, that this can be targeted, and that white's pawns here are very solid. I do see that, you know, black's using his knight to shield the 7th rank, so it's kind of like passive. Either his king or his knight isn't really getting in on the fight. I see the rook is limited. I see white's pieces have freedom of motion. But it's one thing to have a pretty position. It's another thing to try to win a game. To win a game, what do you have to do? You have to attack something at some point, okay? You have to attack something and win it. Typically, first, you have to immobilize it, you know, weaken it, surround it, attack it, you know, then attack it multiple times, possibly maneuver between 2 different targets, eventually win one of them. But at a minimum, at some point to win, you have to attack something. Looking at this position, I do not see what white is ever going to attack to win the game. I just flatly don't see it. Like, the main target that black has that I can see could be this f6 pawn. So white could, you know, put his knight on e4 and bring his bishop all the way back to c3 to threaten it. But I feel like before white would be done doing that, black could play like a move like bishop d5, which threatens bishop takes e4. Or black could arrange a move like f5, just trading pawns. I know the knight would have to be defended by the king, but that can be arranged. If the bishop comes back here, your king doesn't need to defend this. You know, king e8, knight e4, f5. Right? Trading pawns over there. It's hard to imagine that white could both keep control of f5 so this pawn can't advance and attack it with more pieces than black can defend it with. It's really hard for me to imagine that. Also, as white remaneuvers his pieces, black gains the idea of rook h6 to maybe try and trade this rook or to gain counterplay. And just staring at this, like, I can't imagine a scenario where white ever wins if black just sits here doing basically nothing except proactively stopping white's threatening plans. So personally, I just completely can't understand why Carlsen would go for this opening. Does that make sense? Like, I don't think it's the best opening choice. Then concretely, the variation that he went for is like well analyzed, definitely lets Anand play a ton of moves that Anand knows in advance. I mean, Anand should have known at least the 25 moves of Giri versus Rajabov, plus a couple moves of his own analysis. So that just reduces the number of moves Anand has to figure out for himself dramatically. And then there's less pieces on the board, so the tension lasts less long, most likely. So that's my point of confusion at the moment. Let's just hypothesize one or two possible explanations for this. I mean, one option is that Carlsen just wanted to make sure to play a really long game, as he in fact achieved in this game, right? This game was the second longest world championship game ever at like 122 moves or so. That's one accomplishment. I mean, make Anand play for 6 hours. Tire him out. And a friend of mine who saw the, because I was confused about this, I, called a friend, asked them what they thought was going on. He saw the press conference, and he told me that he thought that Anand looked really tired after the game. So there could be a factor of just trying to tire Anand out since he's, 20 years older than Carlsen. Try and tire him out and, maybe then win like a later game. Another theory would be that since Carlsen's ahead by 1 game in the match, he doesn't need to try as hard to win. So this is a very safe position where, his chances of losing are like 0 and he can torture Anand for a while. And maybe, the key factor there would be that maybe he doesn't care if it's just a draw, right? Like maybe he's happy to just draw out the match. Last year I felt like Carlsen might be willing to just sit on a 1-point lead. And there was definitely a game against the Berlin last year, where he played one of those variations with like rook e1 and just trading everything. and obviously was just content to make a draw. But that said, I don't think he feels that comfortable with just a 1-game lead here. That was when he had a 2-game lead last year against Anand, who hadn't beaten him in a single tournament game for years. So this year, Anand already won 1 game against him. So how big is his 1-game lead? I mean, it's still a lot, but you're not sitting pretty or getting comfortable when you're up 1 game against somebody who's beaten you. Anand has 3 whites left after this, 3 chances to like come out of the opening with an advantage, as he's done every game with white so far. So 3 chances, very serious chances to win a game against Carlsen. I doubt Carlsen feels at all confident or comfortable here. Like, you know, he could just draw his games with white and easily win the world championship. I think he still definitely wants to win another game if possible, or at least be putting pressure on Anand so that, you know, Anand's worrying about losing his game, spending effort on analyzing his black openings and so forth, right? So I personally don't think that theory is very likely, that Carlsen's just trying to draw here. I think he must have like had some plan either to win this game or to put some kind of pressure on Anand that's helping him to win the next game, or to keep Anand tired so that Anand doesn't have the energy to win a game himself. Something like that has to be going on. Okay. Another theory, and probably the most plausible, is that white does have some kind of dangerous plan to try to win this position, and I just don't see it. You can also sit around with white in this kind of position and maybe like wait for a blunder from your opponent. Like, his position's unpleasant, there's not much he can move, so maybe at some point he'll blunder. Although I'm maybe not qualified to say this, but I don't really see how it's that plausible to get a blunder out of your opponent here. You know, they've got all their time on their clock to make like 10 moves to get to time control, and there's not that many pieces on the board, not that many legal moves they have to look at. Just doesn't seem very plausible. All right, so now quickly, let's talk about some other interesting points in the game. So first of all, you can see from this position being very nice, you can see the justification for the pawn sack that happens a few moves earlier, if you want to understand the whole pawn sack. So it's this variation here by white with h4. They're allowing black to play f6, forcing the bishop back and capturing on h4. But the resulting position leaves black with these split pawns, and white has the plan to go after h5, which is actually very, very hard to defend. So first you play f3, that stops bishop g4 and knight f3, etc. And you prepare king f2 so you can go rook h1. So black's just trading a piece off. I mean, black also has to deal with the fact that you can always regain your pawn on c7 and you still have a better pawn structure on the king side. So black's trying to just take stuff off. And once the king moves, this knight's under threat, it retreats, and the rook comes here. So we see white quickly wins back this pawn. So that would be a lot of suffering for black. So they grab another pawn and get to this kind of situation, right? And now after g4, white gets this beautiful pawn structure on the king side and the active rook coming to h7. So as we can see, ample compensation for that pawn sack. Black never really has a chance to untangle his pieces and defend his pawns and, you know, not allow white's plan of activating the rook while staying up a pawn. So the whole pawn sack seems very sound for white. They easily get a comfortable position, but not a better position. Now let's go ahead and see this interesting decision that happened in the game. This key choice here by Carlsen to go for this trade. So this is very, very dangerous for black. If Anand just said, hey, I'm up a pawn, I'll return my extra pawn, right? I'll play b6, rook takes e5, king d7. This endgame here is very, very close to losing for black, right? White has 2 connected passed pawns, and black has 2 extra pawns on the queen side with like a not very mobile pawn structure, not very far advanced. White's pawns are already, you know, getting pretty far along if they want. So this position is extremely, extremely dangerous for black, right? Very close to losing. So Anand, in going for that knight e5 move, must have planned, and maybe even planned at home before the game, but must have planned the idea that he could just trade off his bishop for the 2 kingside pawns that are dangerous. What this leaves white with is rook and knight and 2 versus rook and 4 all on the same side of the board. This endgame, I believe, is simply a clear draw. But the interesting feature about it, maybe, if there is an interesting feature, is that it requires fairly precise play, and it's a position that you can actually move around in circles in for 30, 40 moves pretty easily, so you can extend the game. So even though Anand got to play, 20 moves of opening theory or computer prep very quickly, he's still actually, eventually, this game going to end up playing a ton of moves and eventually end up being tired. But what I can tell you is that if this c5 pawn weren't on the board, okay, then the rook, knight, and 2 pawns versus rook and 3 is a win for white. And it's a little bit tricky. Well, no, it's not just a little bit tricky. It's a very tricky endgame. I'm not promising that you would win it as soon as you got it. You definitely have to practice such an endgame quite a bit. Even though I've studied it, I'm not confident that I would beat a strong player in it right now because it's been a while since I studied it. But I know that with very, very good play by white, you can win that endgame. So now you add 1 extra pawn on for black, and I think for sure that moves it from a win for white to a draw for black. So this position here should be a comfortable draw for black. Again, in order to, one quick thing I can say about this endgame to help you understand it is if you want to win this endgame as white, what do you have to do? The same thing you always have to do to win a game. You have to attack a weakness, right? So the obvious point for white to attack is they have to eventually attack c7 to win this position. Now, to attack c7, they're going to have to put their rook here and their knight here or here. And the problem is when both their rook and knight attack here, one option for black is to attack the square the knight wants to be on. And if white plays c4 to anchor the knight, then he runs out of places for his king to hide from checks. So that's basically what you'll see happening over the course of the game is Carlsen's trying to get his knight to d5 and rook to the 7th at the same time. But Anand can always attack the knight when it's on d5. So he moves it back. Gives up on that for now. Now, once the pawn goes to c4, now he has the idea to transfer the knight to d5. But now where's his king going to hide from checks? The only option would be maybe b3. And then you have to watch out for b4 threatening b4, b5 threatening b4 check. I'll show you. Let me get to an actual position where that comes up, maybe, so I can show you the idea. Okay, so I'll show you in this position here as an example. Check here. So here an interesting option for white is this. So, okay, we're not attacking c7 with rook and knight. We're attacking c5 now, but I still get to make my point. Anand, oops, okay, this didn't happen. Anand's going to check the king. And the thing is that, if this king's just getting checked, it can't really hide on a3, which is the one file that's blocked by a pawn because of this checkmate. Does that make sense? So if we go back to the position where white's trying to play knight to d5 here, right? Imagine this knight comes to d5 and rook to e7. Or let's say white plays knight d5 trying to go rook e7. Black can play b5 and on rook here give these checks, and it's hard for the king to hide. Right. So he played b5 here preemptively before the knight could get to d5, right? And now he's preparing to trade this pawn as necessary, and it's hard for these two pieces to go attack one of these pawns because of the series of checks and b4. So I think b5 is the only correct move. I think Anand has to break his fortress here in order to get the draw. He can't just wait for knight c3 and then knight d5 and rook e7. Because once those moves happen, it'll be too late to play b5 because this will be check and then he'll take this. And if he starts checking the king can go hide here. So for example, if I mark time here, mark time here. Actually, yeah. So, oh yeah, another important thing to know about this endgame is that if there's a rook trade, white wins. So rook, you can't go here to protect against white's rook, against white's rook coming to the 7th rank, because this position is a forced win for white. So, so knight comes here, and now basically this is threatened, and black can't really defend against it. But if they now try to prepare for this, see, well, now they're actually in time for that, so white has to bring his king out. And I'm not 100% sure about this. So eventually, you know, black chases white's king away, goes here. Let's just check if this is a win or a loss. I think this might still be a draw. Let's just check here, here, here. Still a draw. So black might still draw even by delaying the moment where they play b5. b5. Rook here, check. Right? So white can't go hide here because of b4. Maybe he could even delay it, but he definitely has to play this move at some point, because that's what deprives the king of the hiding place on a3 is the b4 check possibility. And he's not going to be able to defend this otherwise. He can't just sit with his rook on one of those two squares defending c7. He'll eventually get outmaneuvered. White's king will be able to come into the game. For example, bad move here, here. Okay, so now this is stuck, this is stuck, this is stuck. I can play a move like this. The rook can't move because I'll take here. And, well, black's even low on moves that mark time, right? Like king here, there's knight check. You can play b5 now, or king c7 if we're trying to hold this. And then this forces a rook trade. So at some point or another, he had to play b5 and switch to c6. And now he's got the extra tension here, and he's close to trading. And well, he's trading off for sure one of white's pawns, which leaves, you know, only one left. So he's getting closer to the draw. This wouldn't work as well if he didn't have the extra pawn, because white would be able to threaten to move past it or something like that. Right, if this pawn were gone, white could create a scenario where they're threatening to play c5. And that would force black's hand about trading or not trading, which allows white to make more progress. So that was one good decision that he had to make. Here, rook e5, I thought was like a cool idea, because this move here, well, because basically now you want to target one of these two pawns, and this seemed like a very nice way to try and target the c5 pawn. If he trades, he loses to this. And now you're threatening this, and if he comes back to defend it, you check him and you take it. You can also wait to do that since he has no way to prevent that, right? You can bring your king up to defend your pawns better. If he ever plays b4, now his pawns are just locked, and you can eventually, you can eventually get this pawn from him, right? Wherever he goes, you attack it here, and now just waiting. And eventually you get this, and then you do the same thing with the next pawn. So a rook trade is losing for black here, but just checking gets black a draw here. When the white king goes far enough away, which I guess I didn't show, so let's see. Let's show the king running away from the pawns again, just to be clear. I don't know, you can already switch over here and attack this. Probably. Wait, hang on. Let's see. Check. Here, knight takes. Here. I mean, maybe we should check the white king over here before going for something like this, but that's the kind of idea there. So in the game, he plays knight d7 check, king a5, rook here. He checks him a bit, right? Gets him to walk away. And then this move was actually a very good move. I don't know if rook b2 is not good here, but this move is a very, very nice timing. It definitely gets black a clear draw. And it required careful calculation because in general, you don't particularly want to make this trade too soon. But you see why it's important to be able to keep the tension as black. You can threaten either of these pawns on different squares, and you're threatening to make a draw either way. So here with the trade, if the pawn took, black puts his king here defending this and attacking this. And white can never get, active enough to defend this and go after all these pawns. The plan will be to advance this pawn to sort of distract one of the white pieces as well. Or rook c4 is played in the game. Now he attacks this, takes here. The threat is rook takes b3, king takes c4. The rook needs to defend the knight needs to defend the pawn, so the rook has to go here. And now every single one of white's pieces is paralyzed after Anand plays a5. If the knight moves, this pawn can be taken. If the rook moves, well, if it goes to c4, there's rook c2, rook b3. If it goes to c1, there's rook g1. So the rook can't move. If it goes this way, you lose the knight. And the king can't come up because of rook check and taking his rook. And then king takes knight. So he went this way. The threat was this. And now black can advance and just play rook c3 with the white king was too far away to prevent that. And he just gets the last pawn on b3, right? If he trades, black will just play king b4 again and take that. So, yeah. So they went to this rook and knight versus rook endgame, which is a dead draw as well. So you see, like, Anand was forced to play carefully and precisely and to calculate a bunch of variations in this endgame. So the nice thing about this rook and knight versus rook is that you can make the opponent play for a while. But realistically, I don't feel like Carlsen ever had a chance to win. And that's what I sort of wonder about or question with his choice of openings today is what was his plan with that? Did he think there was some way he could maybe win that? Or was he content to tire Anand out? Maybe it'll be more clear tomorrow or in future days, or maybe, in a later interview, Carlsen will tell us more about his match strategy in this match. Obviously, in the middle of a match, even if you go into a press conference, you're not going to tell the people in the press what your match strategy is because you don't want your opponent to know it. So there's no way we would know right now, like, the honest answer as to what he was going for today. But it seemed like, to me, it was kind of like a dry, boring draw today. So that's why I'm not doing anything much longer. I see nobody has any particular questions about the game. So we'll leave it at that. And tomorrow's game, Anand has white. We'll see if there's any after effects of being tired from the long game today for either of them. We'll see if Anand continues his aggression, and we'll see what opening Carlsen plays next. He's been hopping around with black. So, you can practice your psychological gamesmanship or, like, the psychological decisions that you could make if you were in a world championship match by trying to guess what opening Carlsen will or should play tomorrow. I think something like a Bogo Indian could be possible, or some kind of, bishop b4 queen's gambit decline, something of that sort. I think he's going to keep playing knight f6, e6, etc. Those defenses, just like I expected after the first game. So we'll see how that goes. So far, Anand's got an advantage every game with white, so the match remains really tense and really close, in my opinion. And yeah, I'm looking forward to tomorrow's game to see what will come. If you have any questions or comments or anything you want different with the videos between now and then, just let me know, and I'll be happy to oblige.